when we think about foreign disinformation, there's a question in the chat about asking how much of the success of foreign disinformation is due to certain segments of American society's desire to believe facts that support their own prejudices and beliefs. And I would also add that when you're talking about defamation, of course, that is absolutely true, but a lot of these are more subtle, if you will. You couldn't, even if there was a law that covered these social media outlets, the kind of more sinister foreign involvement are things that are not quite defamation, I wouldn't say. It doesn't seem like, but I'd be interested in your take on that. I mean, they're actually, the more frightening ones are the ones that sort of say things that could plausibly be true, even if they're not, and they're not.
Well, let's take a recent real life example of a piece of video that was highly produced, was meant to be highly persuasive. This happened to feature a claim that Kamala Harris was guilty of a hit and run of a young woman in California some years ago. And there was an AI enhanced actor, as I recall, who played the victim, who claimed that Kamala Harris had hit her in an accident, then escaped. This spread widely on social media, egged on by foreign sources. Could Kamala Harris sue for that? Even New York Times against Sullivan leaves open the possibility that knowingly, maliciously creating a news story and publishing it could lead to liability for libel. The problem is that was not aired on NBC, right? NBC would, of course, would not have aired it, but had NBC aired it, then somebody might have thought about suing for it. It ran instead on social media platforms where people are now very well trained to imagine that there's no potential liability and that they are immune.
And to what extent, that's a good point, actually. To what extent do you think that foreign disinformation kind of plays into the already divided America? People have already made up their minds, and so they pick and choose the things that support what they and are not support what they already believe, and are not open to kind of discussion, civilized discussion on it.
David said earlier, sorry, just be very brief to quote you.
Sure.
David, you said earlier that we are a divided people. We certainly are. That's made the work of malign actors so much easier. It's so much easier to push the windows in both directions. But I think the more significant fact is that the open internet enables interference by foreign malign actors in a way that is unprecedented. And so even if we can imagine a time when we are less divided, the potential for foreign influence is going to remain. Technology has created it. That genie's not going to go back in the bottle. We're going to have to find some other solutions.
And I mean, it's been an old, they've gotten more sophisticated, I think, in the foreign interference, and they've figured out ways of that it's far easier to just exacerbate our own divisions than trying to create new ones. And it's cheap and efficient, and it costs a lot of money, but you can just use bots to amplify certain things and do it very effectively. There was the recent case of Justice Department indicting 2 RT employees, which had opened this company in Tennessee that was producing, and there were sort of, it seems, unwitting Americans who didn't realize they were working for the Russian government by sort of pushing out this sort of divisive content. And that's just a whole new level of sophistication. There's indications that there's more operations like that. If you're ranking the 3, again, Gordon knows this, but Russia is by far the most aggressive and sort of sophisticated in pushing disinformation. They are, trying to aid Trump. This is all according to U.S. intelligence officials, and hurt Harris. Iran is trying to undermine Trump. They're less sophisticated than Russia, but still trying in their own ways to push narratives that will hurt Trump or amplify them online. And it's very interesting. The Chinese are sort of focused more on local races. There was an extraordinary case with Governor Hochul in New York. An aide to her was actually indicted for spying on behalf of China. And a big part of the agenda there was simply pushing for Chinese interests at the state level. It was trying to get less of Taiwan's perspective being, presented to policymakers in the state of New York, not so much in the national government. And the Chinese are sort of sitting out this election, this presidential cycle, but playing a long-term game in terms of influencing and collecting intelligence on state governments. So it's extraordinary what's happening.
Iran is exactly as David says. Iran is catching up to Russia in some of its techniques. They recently were found to be behind a website called Savannah Time. Sounds like a old newspaper in Georgia. It's not. It's created by the Iranians to look like an old newspaper in Georgia. And as David said, it pumped out news stories critical of Trump, very much like the Russians' sites pump out articles critical of Kamala Harris. The Chinese are interesting, as David says. They're probably a little bit more focused on old-fashioned spycraft and corrupting of our officials, which is a time-tested method for other countries. But there have been times when they have taken a page out of the Russian book. You may recall at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the justifications that the government in Moscow gave for the invasion was saying that they had that there were U.S. bioweapons labs in Ukraine, and therefore Russia had to go in and do something about them. There were not, of course, U.S. bioweapons labs in Ukraine. One of our China analysts was surprised to see a highly produced video story on the website of China Daily, one of the Chinese Communist Party's publications, claiming that there are U.S. bioweapons labs in Kazakhstan, the purpose of which, according to Chinese disinformation, was to develop a virus to be injected into camels who migrate from Kazakhstan into China. And in that migration and the infection, harm Chinese people. This was beautifully produced, entirely made up, but a similar theme to the ones that the Russians have used to great effect, that the U.S. operates bioweapons labs. So I think the Russians have been at this the longest. They've been at it well before the internet. Some of you may remember the claim that the U.S. government created AIDS, HIV/AIDS. That started in a newspaper article in English in a newspaper in Africa, written by a Soviet agent. So the Russians have been at this, a good long time. But I would be very concerned, and am very concerned, that the Chinese are fast learners, and they will have seen the success of some of these Russian and Iranian techniques. And I'd be very surprised if they don't become more aggressive.
At this point, do you think that that's more of seeing best practices and trying to emulate them, or is there any sphere in which there seems to be actually collusion?
Among the three, do you mean?
Yeah, among the three, or even just China and Russia.
We certainly have seen the Russian disinformation sites pick up on Chinese disinformation and vice versa. I don't know that it's intentional collusion. It may just be echoing anti-American, anti-Western themes.
My colleague Dan DeLuce, I mentioned earlier, covers the intelligence community. He asked a U.S. official about this recently, and there's no clear evidence that the three countries are colluding together. They're acting independently. I think, picking up methods from each other, but there's no evidence of that.